In American society, money is a taboo topic. We're taught at a young age it's improper to talk about it, but we're also bombarded with messages about the power and importance of money in our everyday lives. And by not talking about it, we miss out on the skills and lessons we need to effectively understand and financially plan. That changes today. Welcome to Money Tales. Hosted by Sandy Brager and Cami Doder, Money Tales brings more than 35 years of combined professional experience in personal finance to demystify money and demonstrate what it's like to speak openly about personal financial matters. Join us each episode as they interview modern-day movers and shakers about how money decisions intertwine with their daily lives in order to give you better insight into productive financial conversations. Subscribe today and register for our blog Fathom at aspiriant.com/podcasts to increase your money mojo. And now, here's Cami and Sandy.
This week's Money Tales episode is all about how easy it can be to find yourself in financial trouble. Our guest is Mike Robbins. In 2005, pressured by the rising housing market with no savings, Mike and his wife Michelle bought a home with no money down. That was the thing you could do back then. The negative amortization loan they secured seemed manageable at first, but Mike and Michelle soon realized they were sinking deeper and deeper into debt with no equity to show for it. They were getting by, and life was getting good for the couple. Mike's business was starting to thrive. Then the housing market crashed. By 2009, Mike's business had halved, and they were hundreds of thousands of dollars underwater. With 2 young children and a declining business, they were left asking, how did this happen? That's when they hunkered down and started chipping away at the problem to change their situation. Today, Mike is the author of 5 books, including Bring Your Whole Self to Work and We're All in This Together. Mike delivers keynotes and seminars that empower people, leaders, teams, and organizations to be more successful, appreciative, and authentic. Prior to his current work, Mike played baseball at Stanford and then professionally with the Kansas City Royals.
Here are 3 key money topics Mike hits on in this conversation. First, how growing up in a family without a lot of money motivated Mike to turn his love of baseball into a professional career on the mound. Second, what it was like as a 21-year-old in 1995 to get a $35,000 signing bonus to play for the Kansas City Royals and then make $850 per month for the season. And third, how telling himself in his 30s, I'm going to start practicing learning how to save, was the mindset shift Mike needed to shed the shame of having debt and become a successful saver. We hope you share this episode with a friend, and please subscribe to Money Tales on your favorite podcast platform. Now on to our conversation with Mike Robbins.
Welcome to the Money Tales podcast. I'm Cami Doder.
And I'm Sandy Brager.
Sandy, I had the quickest money conversation I could ever imagine. I was coming back from the grocery store. I had walked there and there was a crossing guard. And as a lot of the crossing guards are around our area, they're often retired. And so just, hi, how are you? Beautiful day outside, one of those. And he just happens to say, I can't remember if it was around our work or whatever, but he said, God, I just wish I had saved more.
Unprompted.
Yeah, he said, I wish when I was younger, I had saved more. And there wasn't time. The walk sign was blinking. I had to get to the other side. I wish I had gone back and had a chat with him. I can't shake this because this gentleman has this wish. Reminds me of all the conversations we've had around understanding and talking more about money and knowing your values and knowing what you need it for, and how this gentleman has really impacted me because he said, we live in a very expensive area and I didn't know rents would be so expensive. So he has to augment his savings with this crossing guard job.
Are you going to have money conversations with him?
I might have to go back.
I kind of like this. Every time you cross, you could have continue your conversation.
I really can. I also appreciate that how these conversations can be short. I learned something from it, made me think about my savings and my spending and being intentional. And money can just fly out of my purse very quickly. And just this little conversation made me think about it. And I really appreciated him sharing with me.
Cami, you're showing that money conversations happen all the time in places you don't necessarily expect it. And sometimes they're long, sometimes they're really short.
Well, let's have a little longer conversation with our guest today, Mike Robbins. It's wonderful to be talking with you on Money Tales.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Would you introduce yourself and share a couple pivotal moments that have taken place in your life that really impacted who you are today?
Probably the first one is when my parents split up when I was 3. So I grew up in Oakland, California, in the Bay Area, where I still live here in the Bay Area. And that was big in my life. And ultimately, as it related to money and many things, as I would figure out later on. And another pivotal moment for me was I got drafted out of high school by the New York Yankees and didn't end up signing a contract with the Yankees because I got a chance to play baseball in college at Stanford, and then got drafted out of Stanford by the Kansas City Royals. And I did sign a pro contract. Went into the minor leagues as you do in pro baseball. And unfortunately, I got injured. I was a pitcher and I hurt my arm. So my baseball career ended when I was 25 years old, half my lifetime ago now. And after working for a couple of years in the .com world in the late 90s, I started my own consulting business a little over 20 years ago. And for the last couple of decades, I've been writing and speaking and now podcasting more recently, but a lot about leadership and teamwork and authenticity. So those moments, though, early on were really pivotal to me and how I think about life, and especially this conversation we're going to have.
Mike, your parents splitting when you're 3, and you alluded that impacted your money journey. Will you share a little bit more about that?
Do you remember, by the way? It's hard to remember things when you're 3, but that's an impactful event to happen.
Well, a couple of my earliest memories, and again, I don't know if I just remember it emotionally or practically. I was about 3.5 when my dad left, and he left in a very dramatic way. We were living in Oakland, and my dad packed up and drove back to Connecticut, where he was from. But he eventually came back pretty soon after that. I don't know why, but I think he didn't want to leave. My mom basically kicked him out. And it was the 70s. And my mom, who was a feminist before her time and had gone to college, first one in her family to do that, and was a teacher. But when my parents got married and then my older sister was born, my dad said to my mom, "I don't want you to work." And he basically gave her an allowance. My mother passed away about 13 years ago. But if you met my mom, especially in the years that I knew my mother, the fact of being married to someone who would tell her, "You can't work and here's your allowance," I can't even imagine. My dad in later years reflected on the fact that that was ridiculous and very chauvinistic of him, but it was of the time. And he was even able to acknowledge later he was just scared. He saw friends of his whose wives were working at the time and they were starting to get divorced or leave or things of that nature. It was just such a different world in those days. But I do remember, I have a memory of my sister, who was 4 years older than me, and my mother being very upset and crying as my dad was leaving, and I didn't understand why. And then the second memory that often comes to my mind when I think back to the early part of my life, a few years later, it was raining. We had a big rainstorm over a series of weeks in the Bay Area, and the ceiling in our living room was leaking. And I thought it was fun and funny, and we were getting pots because the ceiling was leaking. I look over, my mother, who was very strong, pretty stoic woman, broke down on the floor crying. And again, I didn't understand, but here she was trying to raise 2 kids and didn't have a lot of money. And it was just scared. I can only imagine what that must have been like. But I remember thinking in the moment, this isn't okay. Something's wrong. I don't know what exactly is wrong, but something is wrong. And while I think this is fun and funny, clearly my mother does not. And we have some kind of a problem.
How did you take these emotional situations and bring them into your life, especially as it related to money?
What ended up happening, just to go further down into the story, I mean, my dad was in radio. My dad did okay financially, but my mother wasn't working. And then as my dad left, my mom started to work more, but she wanted flexibility to be around us. So she took some work, but part-time, half-time, and didn't want to go back into teaching. My dad actually had bipolar disorder. And in those days, nobody knew what that was. It was called manic depression. And there was a lot of shame around it and confusion. My dad ended up losing his job in the early 80s. And was in and out of hospitals and mental institutions because he had pretty serious mental health challenges. But again, we didn't understand that. I didn't understand that. It just was this other strange thing. So I say all of that because by the time I was probably 10 years old, I knew we were broke. And we were living in this house that was falling apart and had this car that was run down. But I lived in Oakland. I did have some friends and some kids that lived in the hills that had some money, but a lot of kids who didn't. So it wasn't that abnormal to be raised by a single mom or be around other kids who didn't have a lot of money. But I was very conscious of it. And I was very much, even as a young kid, determined, I don't want to grow up like this. I don't know what it's going to take, but I am going to figure out how to make some money. And that was part of my passion for baseball. I was like, oh, I'm good at this. And then when I realized, oh, if you play professional baseball, you make a lot of money. That was definitely part of the motivation. I love the game, but I was like, I could be rich and famous if I do this well. Sign me up. So that definitely was a big part of my impetus for wanting to really focus on baseball.
Thanks for bringing that up, because you said you had the chance coming out of high school to sign with the New York Yankees.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of money for that time of your life. Tell us about deciding not to choose that route.
Well, no pun intended. This will be a little inside baseball. The way the baseball draft actually works, there's a bunch of rounds in the draft. And the Yankees actually drafted me pretty late in the draft. And they didn't know I'd already had a minor injury to my pitching arm. And so the option to go to Stanford, and I'd gotten recruited to play at Stanford, and it was a pretty good financial setup. It wasn't going to cost us very much money for me to go to Stanford. That was actually a better option, both in terms of education and the future, but also even in terms of baseball. Because if you go to Stanford, which is a pretty good baseball program, and do well there, which I did, you were probably going to have a chance 3 or 4 years later to get drafted again. It was a risk. I mean, I could have gotten hurt and then never played again, but I thought about it. And, if the Yankees had drafted me in the first round that year, the first round draft pick by the Yankees that year was a guy named Derek Jeter. So he did all right for himself. So I probably would have signed a contract with the Yankees at that time if they were going to offer me hundreds of thousands of dollars. At that point, people were starting to get the biggest signing bonuses in the draft were about $1 million. I probably would have signed if I had that option, but that wasn't an option for me. And the route to go to Stanford was better. But the first time in my life that I ever actually had any of my own money was when the Royals drafted me 3 years later.
Tell us about that, because I'm curious about how you were making these decisions, if you had people who were advising you.
Not really. I mean, that's another thing. So in my house, it's not that we didn't talk about money, but my mother didn't know much about money. She didn't have much financial education or literacy. She'd gone to Tufts, but had been a teacher. She was a really smart woman, very well educated. But like a lot of us, I went all the way through Stanford and got my degree and had a pretty good education. I didn't learn anything about money in school. Nothing.
Amazing, right?
And I didn't learn about anything at home. And my mom would talk about money in an interesting way. She was obsessed with people who were rich and famous, but also there was a lot of negative conversations about rich people. Rich people are bad and rich people are selfish and rich people are greedy and things like that. As I look back on it now, I think it was more fear-based and envy-based. It was like, oh, the beautiful people over there, aren't they so fortunate? But there was a lot of bitterness towards it. There was a lot of, we can't afford it. We don't do that. And to me, my dream as a kid was to be able to go on vacation, go to Disneyland. The kids went to Disneyland and Lake Tahoe. Those were the two things that all of the kids that I wanted to be in the families where mom and dad were together. They went on vacations and their house was clean and you could invite people over and not be embarrassed. Those were my benchmarks as a kid growing up. When I grow up, I want to go on vacation. I want to have a nice enough house that when I invite people over, I'm not embarrassed. And if I get married, I'd like to stay together with my wife if we have some kids.
Mike, when you were playing for the Kansas City Royals and then you got hurt, this is now stopping a dream and then this financial potential. Tell us more about that.
So I get drafted in the 9th round by the Royals in 1995 out of Stanford, and I get a $35,000 signing bonus. That's what I get. And they also agree to pay for the rest of my school because I had another year. I get drafted as a junior. So that's the financial package.
I think that was my salary that year. I mean, that's big money.
That's good.
In 1995, 35 grand for a 21-year-old, that's a lot of money.
For sure.
Now, again, in the scheme of pro sports, that's not huge, but I was really grateful to have that and excited. The rest of my school was going to be paid for. I was going to come back the next year to finish. I go, and the thing I wanted, I bought myself a used 1990 Honda Accord that was nice and clean. And I think I spent $9,000 on it. And I was so proud of that car. To me, it was like, I am an adult with a real car. I'd had a couple pretty janky cars as a teenager, but this was a real car. And I would get in that 1990 Honda Accord and I would keep it very clean. I know there's much nicer cars one can have, but to me, this was a really nice car and I was super proud of that. But in the minor leagues, when you sign back then, and even still now, I mean, My first year of professional baseball, I made $850 a month
Okay.
only during the season. That's it. Basically, my first month in the minor leagues, I think I spent more on my calling card bill. You remember calling cards? Than my check was. Literally, it was hundreds of dollars because I was so homesick and I was just on the phone all the time calling my girlfriend and people back home that I spent a couple $100 on my calling card. And that's what my check was. And I was like, oh, this isn't going to work. I'd never gotten paid like that before. I'm going to have to figure out how to manage money. I mean, I'd had jobs at restaurants and things when I was in junior high and high school, but now it's like, oh, I got to figure out how to save the rest of this money that I didn't spend on the car and then figure out how to live like an adult. But I end up a few years later, my third year in, I'm making $1,200 a month and I get hurt and then I get released.
Now what?
Now I'm 24, going on 25. I don't know what. And I'm stuck. And what am I going to do? What am I qualified to do? I end up getting a job working in sales for an internet company. And the guy who hired me, this was during the dot-com boom. They were just hiring anybody and everybody. The guy who hired me had been a left-handed pitcher like me at the University of North Carolina. And he liked that I played baseball at Stanford. And he basically was like, you seem like a good guy.
You're in.
You're in. He's like, if you could play baseball at Stanford and play pro ball, you can figure out how to sell internet advertising. And I was like, okay. I mean, that was it.
He's probably right.
I didn't even know how to turn on my laptop. I was like, what am I doing? I'm selling banner ads. So that's what I did for a couple of years. I did that for about a year and a half at that one company. And I did start to learn a little bit about money, and I was getting paid. I was getting commissions on deals that I was closing. I was having to negotiate these $10, $20, $50, $100,000 ad campaigns. And I'm 25 years old. So it was a lot of just learning on the job, but I was learning from people around me. And there was just a lot of money flowing at that time with all of these internet companies, and companies were advertised on the internet. And there were a bunch of young people like me who were in charge of all of this, but I didn't know what the hell I was doing.
Mike, how would you characterize your relationship with money at that point in time after having lived without very much financial means for most of your life, having that situation where you get a huge signing bonus only to learn that the monthly pay during the season was pretty low?
And I ended up blowing through that money, not on anything else really, but just living.
Sure.
I didn't know how to manage money. No one taught me about that. I had no real awareness. I had a lot of fear. There was a lot of scarcity. And I was really sad because I thought my pathway to make a lot of money was going to be a professional baseball player. And I had done a really good job putting myself in position to do that. But then I never was able to make much money playing. I mean, the bonus was nice, but it did go away. And now I was like, what am I going to do? And what happened was I actually got a job working for the second internet company I worked for. They gave me a big bump in salary, a lot of commission, and a bunch of stock options. And it was supposed to go public and we were all going to get rich. That was the plan. Because now this was happening to a lot of people my age. Oh, hey, this company went public. That company went public.
Money was so easy back then.
I bet they were throwing some great parties too.
I know, great
yeah.
parties. So I'm 26 years old. I get a job working for a sports website called rivals.com. I've got this nice big salary. I've got a nice commission structure, and I have all these stock options. And I literally take that job in April of 2000, right as the NASDAQ crashes. But we still don't really understand what that means. But within a few months, I get laid off in the summer of 2000. And everyone started getting laid off that fall and into that winter and into the early part of the next year. And I was like, oh no, what am I going to do? They gave me a little bit of severance. Similar, I hadn't saved any money. I wasn't making a whole lot of money. I was making enough to live in San Francisco at the time. I thought I was cool and I could go out and have a few drinks and hang out. And I'm a young person in San Francisco. But now it's like, what am I going to do? So I had, again, a lot of fear and a lot of scarcity and didn't really have any savings, no parents who could come in and say, here you go. And I tried to find a job. I couldn't find a job. Everybody was getting laid off. There was a ton of talent in the market. I had a little bit of sales skills. I had some connections from Stanford, but I didn't really know. I didn't want to keep selling internet advertising. What I really wanted to do was write and speak and coach people and try to inspire them. But I was like, how am I going to make money doing that? That seems like you have to be famous or write a book or be on TV or something. And I was a 26-year-old kid who had played minor league baseball.
But you did it.
I met my wife, Michelle, right at that time. She owned a staffing company in San Rafael, Marin County, a little north of San Francisco. And she was doing decently well with it and had worked really hard to start this company and grow it. And she said to me, starting a business is hard, but not as hard as you think. And you can totally do it. And so I decided at the beginning of 2001, I was going to start my business as a speaker and a coach and hopefully an author one day. But again, I had no idea how I would make money doing that. But I figured people were telling me, go back to school, get a degree in psychology or organizational development or something. And I love to learn, but I didn't really love school. So I was like, I'll just design my own curriculum is what I called it. I'll probably be broke and in debt. But if I went to school, I'd be broken in debt anyway. I just won't have a degree at the end of it. And if I can't get this business off the ground in this first year, I'll figure out how to get a job. And that was my plan. And 23 years later, I'm still speaking and writing and coaching and
Now a podcaster.
I eventually figure out how to make money, but it was pretty lean in those early years for sure. But thankfully, we didn't have kids or a mortgage. I wasn't married. And I remember thinking if I could make $2,000 a month, I could basically cover all my bills. $3,000 a month, I could go out and have a few fun dates. And that seemed like an enormous amount of money to have to generate every month.
It sounds like you were creating short-term goals for yourself, though. You're putting some benchmarks out there for what you wanted to attain.
I was, but things really got interesting. Michelle and I did get married in 2005 and then had a baby right away. She came a month early and was born literally 8 months to the day after we got married, which we weren't planning on having babies that fast, but we did. We were living in the city renting, and Michelle really wanted us to buy a house. So we bought a house in 2005, back when, remember those days when no money down? The guy that encouraged us to get the loan, we had no money saved, zero.
Not a problem.
No problem. No money down, stated income, go for it. And he qualifies us for this loan. And I'm like, this doesn't feel right. But we were scared that if we didn't buy a house, we'd get so priced out of the market, we were going to have to move somewhere 3-4 hours away. He even negotiated with the folks we bought the house from. They paid the closing costs. We literally paid $0 to buy this house. And then in the first year or so, it went up and we were trying to manage. We had debt and we were just a mess financially. Me and my wife, educated. She has a master's in psychology. We're relatively competent people, but we literally knew nothing about money and how to manage it. It was basically a negative amortization loan that I didn't even know what that meant or what that was. I was like, oh, the payment, we can manage the payment. But it's like, yeah, you're accumulating more debt as you go with this thing and you put no money down. You have no equity in this house. But again, nobody explained this to me. I had to learn the hard way. We even refinanced to pay off some other debt. And then the housing market imploded and the economy imploded and my business was getting better. I'd actually written 2 books and we'd had 2 babies in the span of about 3 years. I was doing decently well. And then 2009 hit and all of a sudden my business went down by half and we were hundreds of thousands of dollars underwater in our house. And we didn't even totally understand what that meant or how that happened. And all of a sudden it was like, we still had other debt and we were just like, uh-oh, this isn't working. And I felt like my mother must have felt sitting on that floor with the roof leaking. My wife wasn't working. We had 2 young children. We had a mortgage. I'm running this business that was going decently well, but now it's not going so great. And we're deeply in debt. And I'm like, how the hell did this happen?
Thanks for sharing that story. It's just a reminder, this stuff builds on itself. It's not like you guys, when you met in 2001, you said, yeah, we're really going for it. It just slowly builds. Would you share with us how you got yourself out of the sinking ship?
Yeah. So what we finally did was we had to really sit down. It was a come to Jesus moment for both me and Michelle and go, okay, we don't know how to manage our finances. We're not living extravagantly and doing crazy things. We're just living a little bit beyond our means all the time, every month. And it's adding up and it's adding up and it's adding up. And we're trying to not keep up with the Joneses, but just keep up with life in an expensive place like the Bay Area. And so we first started, we met a woman who helped us literally make a budget and coached us, super basic. And Michelle and I would meet and have these money meetings. And almost every time we'd get in a fight and one or both of us would cry and get really upset. But we had to really work through it. Okay. And start to track it and okay, watch. Oh, I see. This is what's happening. And then as we started to realize the reality of our situation, we read a book by Dave Ramsey, I think, and it was like, follow the baby steps or whatever the heck he said. But we're like, let's do it. And then we started doing it. And we're like, we have to pay off this debt. So we started to figure out how to pay off our credit card debt. And Michelle had some grad school debt that was still there. And then there was the whole situation with our house. And over the span of the next few years, we did a short sale on our house and we paid off over $100,000 in debt. And it was not by magically money just falling out of the sky, but we ended up through the process of it, the big shift that I had in my mind, and I often share this with people whenever we talk about money, if they're in debt or they're stuck in debt. I felt so much shame and so much embarrassment about still having debt. Here I was in my 30s with 2 kids and I'm writing books and I'm this motivational speaker and I have all this debt. Like, what's wrong with me? I'd never learned how to save money. And when I shifted in my mind and I said, you know what, I'm going to start practicing learning how to save. And right now I'm starting in the hole, but all the money I'm paying towards the debt, instead of thinking about it as paying off debt, I'm going to think about it as practicing for savings, because that's what it is. It's just we're in the negative. And once we get back to zero, the money I'm paying towards the debt, I'm just going to keep paying it, but that's going to be towards us. And we're going to start building actual savings and wealth. And when I did that, I got excited because I was like, ooh, this feels more fun. This feels more positive and hopeful, instead of, oh my God, I'm such an idiot. I have all this debt. What's wrong with me? Let me pay it off really fast. Because I would sometimes pay off our debt and then we'd go back into debt. That's what would happen. It was a cycle. I would get almost to zero and then we'd go back down. And that was the big shift. And then after the short sale, which was super humbling, doing a short sale is kind of like filing bankruptcy, just not quite as bad. But we moved from the East Bay over to Marin and we rented. And going from being a homeowner to being a renter was pretty humbling. And we rented 2 houses over 5 years and actually started to really save money and pay attention. And our financial situation dramatically changed over the span of a relatively short amount of time that we're super proud of, and bought the house that we live in now back in 2016 that we love. And it ended up being, just to bring it full circle, my mom sadly passed away in 2012, but my sister and I sold the house that we grew up in. And even that falling apart house that my dad had bought for $35,000 in 1973, we sold for $750,000. I mean, this is the Bay Area. The thing, by the way, now is worth $1.5 million, but in 2012, we sold it for $750,000. But there was this money all of a sudden that my sister and I had. We'd never been given any money by our family, by our parents. Both of our parents were gone. And all of a sudden it was this gift that just fell out of the sky. But the blessing was that I actually knew what to do with that money when I got it, because we had really cleaned our house financially. And that money went towards the down payment that we ultimately were able to buy the house that we live in now. And when I walk around my house now, I think about both of my parents on a regular basis and I thank them.
Oh, what a great legacy story. And even perhaps more importantly, a story of the power of changing mindset, just looking at life differently, giving yourself different messages to incite you along. I'm curious, as you think back to that time when you and Michelle were deep into debt with the growing family, young children, it sounds very stressful.
It was.
As you look back at that time today, what do you think you learned the most from each other in terms of talking about money?
It's funny. It was really stressful for each of us and both of us. We talk about it now sometimes. And we stayed committed to still having fun with each other and with the girls when they were little. Our girls are now 18 and 15. But I do think it was a real gut check moment for us. And I think both of us, reflecting on it now, I'm so grateful to be married to Michelle. And I feel like it was a reminder of why we married each other and why we love each other so much, that even though we got in lots of fights and it was super stressful, it was like, okay, we're going to have to figure out how to relate differently to each other and about this thing. Because she had a whole different money conversation and story from her own growing up, but similar to mine, wasn't very empowered. Her family didn't have a lot of money, but they weren't broke like my family was. They just never talked about it. And especially as a girl, Michelle's a few years older than I am, so she's in her mid-50s. Nobody talked to her about money. The idea in those days was, why would you talk to a girl about money? You only talk to the boys about money. But her family also just doesn't talk about sensitive, uncomfortable things. So it was just, she didn't know. So we both had to educate ourselves. And then we had to learn about how we deal with money, how we talk about money, how we relate to it. And I feel like now we both have different skills. Michelle is much more frugal than I am in a really good way. Because my issue sometimes now that we have some money, which I'm grateful for, because I grew up with so much lack and so much don't spend it and we don't have it, I will, if I'm not conscious and she's not around to keep me in check, I will just overspend and be like, screw it, we can do that and I'll just make more money. And she's like, okay, but really? And I'm like, thank you.
So you balance each other out, it sounds like.
We do. And it's super interesting now raising teenagers, one of whom is about to go off to college. And now they have their own debit cards and they have their own savings accounts and checking accounts, and trying to talk to them about money. And their relationship to money is so different because they've grown up very differently than we've grown up. And that's a whole other thing that we're just now really embarking on and asking a lot of friends for advice. How did you talk to your kids about money? How did you empower them when they went off to college and as they're getting older? And we're still figuring that one out. But I'm grateful that we have such good communication about it that I trust we'll figure it out.
These money conversations are so important.
Oh my gosh. Well, and look, you know this, I'm sure you talk about this on the show, but it's what breaks up people more than anything. It's one of the hardest things. People will talk about sex and politics and all kinds of stuff before they'll talk about money.
Mike, isn't that weird?
It's so weird. Michelle used to joke about this. We would go to a party. Well, this is back when we were dating, before we had kids, and I'd get in the car and I'd be like, do you know so-and-so makes this much or what? And she's like, how the hell do you know that? I was like, I don't know. I just asked. We talk about it. I've always been weird, and I try not to be super nosy and inappropriate, but I like to talk about things that are a bit taboo. I like to offer stuff first or talk about numbers and things just because I'm like, why are we so squeamish about it? Why are we so secret about it? You walk into the car dealership, it says how much the car costs. You look on Zillow, you see how much the house is worth. But then when it comes to the money that we have or the money that we make or the money that we save or the money that we spend, it's like, ooh. And I respect people's privacy for sure, but I just don't understand why we don't talk about it more openly. Because I feel like I grew up in this way that it all seemed like a big secret to me, that all the people with money knew the secret, but I didn't know the secret and I was pissed about it. So that I want to find out the secret. Yeah.
We're just not talking.
Yeah. And you also said, Mike, your mom, she was obsessed with rich people, but then there was a negative label. It's very common. But when you get in the conversations, you realize they have challenges just like you, and you learn from what have they done to achieve certain things. And I think it's just really powerful.
Totally.
And also, just to say that one of the things that's coming out loud and clear in this conversation with you is how important our macroeconomic backdrop is in our own personal money stories.
Yeah.
You live through many different economic cycles already, and that comes to the fore in your stories.
For sure.
It's important to talk about these things and open it up.
Well, and understanding what that means. One of the things that I learned, or how I thought about it in my mind, once I started to figure some things out, I think of money in different quadrants. There's making money, there's managing money, there's saving money, and there's investing money. And I realized early on when Michelle and I started to have those come to Jesus conversations, I was like, I don't really know much about any of them. Maybe the making money thing is all I've really been focused on, but the managing money, not so strong. The saving money, we hadn't done any of that. And over the years, I feel like I've gotten better at those. And the investing piece is still the one that's the most confusing to me, but that's where I feel like I'm grateful that we have wonderful people in our life who can help us with that, because I don't want to be an expert in that. More power to people like yourselves and others who work in that world and know it, and people who do it. But that's not what I want to invest my time and energy into, learning as much as learning enough to know that I'm interested and I can pay attention and try to ask some questions, but trusting people who are smarter than me and know what they're doing. But yeah, the backdrop and the macro situation is really important. And I wouldn't have understood that even probably going through the Great Recession was the one where I realized, oh yeah, when it rains, everyone gets wet. So you have to pay attention to that. But again, those types of things, I don't understand. I'm preaching to the choir here. I don't understand why we don't talk more about this in school, as an example. I mean this with a lot of love and respect to education and educators, but there's so much stuff that I learned in elementary school and junior high school and high school and even in college that is completely irrelevant to my life. If I could have had a basic finance class, personal finance, how to manage, how to balance your checkbook, even though we don't use checkbooks anymore, but how to pay your bills, or how credit works, or how to get a loan or a mortgage, or how to invest money, and those types of things. I didn't want to be an econ major, but I did want to learn. I also didn't learn in school, by the way, how to communicate with another human being or how to resolve a conflict.
You're really hitting on something, because I believe that you're correct. We need more financial literacy education, but we also need more communication courses. We need to help people engage in these conversations, because I can talk to you all day long about personal finance and what it means and how it works. But if you're not open to the conversation and you can't engage, it's just not going to stick.
Totally. One other thing I will say though, too, is one of the things that really helped me, Cami, too, in terms of my mindset changing about, I remember one of our financial advisors years ago asked Michelle and I, how do you feel about being wealthy? And we both had this weird reaction. That sounds great, but we don't relate to that word. And I realized I had a weird negative connotation with that word, probably from how I was raised. But I heard Tony Robbins say something years ago, though, that really resonated with me. He said, having money just makes you more of who you are. If you're a jerk and you have a lot of money, you're just more of a jerk. If you're a really kind, loving, generous person, you have a lot of money, you just now have more money to be kind and loving and generous with. So without oversimplifying it, I just think if I genuinely think I'm a good person, a kind person, a generous person, a loving person, then having more money will allow me to be able to focus on those things in a way that can benefit other people. The more stressed I am about money, the more I'm running around chasing money from a scarcity perspective, I'm just not as good of a husband or a father or a human being as I can be. And so that's one of the ways now when I think about wanting to continue to make money and grow our wealth, that's my motivation for it, is I feel like it gives me more freedom to be who I am and do what I really want to do in the world, as opposed to simply just worrying about how are we going to pay for college or pay the mortgage or do whatever the thing is that needs to be done.
Mike, tell us, what's your next money conversation going to be and who's it going to be with?
Well, there's a series of conversations that we're having right now with both of our daughters, especially the one who's going off to college. And so talking to her about how that's all going to work, how we're going to support her when she's in college, but how she's going to manage her finances. So I don't know exactly all the conversations yet. We're starting to have them. And as we're having them, I'm realizing, oh, we have to have more. Oh, we haven't thought about that, or we got to figure that out. So those are the ones that are the most important. I'm excited and a little nervous about them at the moment.
Mike, there's no right and wrong. It's just doing it, and you're doing it. So congratulations. Where is the best place for our listeners to find you digitally?
Probably our website, which is just mike-robbins.com.
Perfect. Mike, what a pleasure to have this conversation. Thanks for sharing so much with us on Money Tales.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Money Tales podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, share it with someone you think would benefit from listening, and leave us a review on your favorite podcasting platform. Your ratings and reviews help more people find our podcast. If you're inspired to gain clarity and peace of mind about financial matters, don't hesitate to reach out to our team at Aspiriant. Go to aspiriant.com/start a dialogue. Or you can email Sandy and me at podcasts@aspiriant.com. See you next time.